Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anne-Marie Morell, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Politichicks.com and also the co-author of the new book, What Women Really Want, which I wrote with my co-anchors, Dr. Gina Loudon and Morgan Brittany. And tonight I'm honored to take the place of Dr. Jamie Glazov, someone who everyone who knows me knows that I have a major writer crush on this man. Daniel Greenfield is a writer for Front Page Magazine. He is prolific. He writes, I don't know, 7, 8, 12 articles per day, including his daily blog on Front Page Magazine. It's called The Point. And one of my favorite blogs of all time, even over Politichicks, sorry Politichicks, Sultan Kanish, Daniel Greenfield, and you're also a Shillman fellow. I mean, you're like everything. You're a Shillman fellow, you're a journalist, you're everything. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here, Daniel.
Thank you.
I'm sorry when I say all this. I really am just such a fan. I start every single morning reading Sultan Kanish. And Jamie wanted me to ask you the first question, so forgive me ahead of time. But he wanted me to ask you about the coats behind you.
The coats, yeah. Well, the apartment is in a state of permanent transition, so to speak. So, it's kind of like Iraq. There's all sorts of things going on. There's a possible ISIS presence under the table and a whole lot of furniture that's being moved around.
Okay, well, Jamie, there you go. I asked your question. I'll never do that again. Okay, Daniel, the more serious news of the day. You wrote about the U.S. Treasury has recently deemed that the Boston Marathon attacks were not necessarily terrorism, or they haven't deemed them terrorism yet. The administration did the same thing with the Fort Hood shooting. What does this mean to the families of the victims?
Well, for the families, it obviously means that in some cases they aren't getting the money that they're supposed to receive. Businesses aren't getting the money that they should receive. And for the administration, it means that they can go on pretending that there isn't a terrorist threat because they insist that there isn't one. So they can just rename and relabel reality.
Why would they do this, Daniel? Why?
Well, we can see this with ISIS now in Iraq, where Obama spent 2 terms insisting that terrorism does not exist. To do that, you just have to keep denying until something happens that's big enough and scary enough that it's no longer possible to deny it anymore. But things like the Fort Hood massacre, that could just be relabeled. That was down to airborne PTSD. Nidal Hassan specifically stated that he was acting in support of the Taliban, but that wasn't admitted at the trial, and the media refused to cover it. Likewise, the Boston massacre, Obama's response to that was, let's not jump to any conclusions. And a year later, no conclusions have been jumped to.
Let's talk about ISIS. You wrote that arming the Syrian opposition is the same as arming ISIS. And you wrote, we can't defeat terrorists by arming terrorists. Explain that, and should we give this blank check of $500 million to the Syrian rebels?
It's going to come right back at us. It already has come right back at us. We've been hit by Stinger missiles that were sent by Qatar under Obama's discretion to the Libyan rebels. Now, this is going to happen in Syria on a much, much larger scale, because what we actually have, the Free Syrian Army that's often talked about is a myth. You have different militias on the ground. These militias sometimes affiliate as the Free Syrian Army, but they affiliate in different ways. Almost all of them are not very distinguishable in terms of ideology from ISIS. They just happen to have different bosses. They all have the objective of setting up an Islamic State in Iraq. So when we're arming these groups as alternatives to ISIS, they're basically ISIS, except that they have their own agenda. They have their own caliph they want.
Well, now with ISIS beheading Americans and beheading lots of people, what do we do about ISIS? Do we attack them? Do we put boots on the ground? Do we ignore them? Do we do kind of a more intelligent way? Do we use economic sanctions and stop giving them money?
Well, it's always a good idea to stop giving them money. One of the important things to remember is that ISIS is beheading people there until they come here. That's not just idle talk. In Australia, there have been major raids now on a group that were plotting to kidnap somebody in Australia, behead him, put up an Islamic State flag, again, in Australia. And they were answering to directions from an Australian ISIS commander in Iraq. So this is going to come here. It's just a matter of time. And while economic sanctions are good in theory, groups like ISIS operate mostly under the radar. They operate on drugs. They operate on kidnappings. They make money from ransoms, for example. A lot of their operations are black market already, and that's not something that can be reached by sanctions. Ultimately, the only way to kill an enemy is to kill an enemy. It's either that or talk him to death, which John Kerry's been trying to do.
So what do we do? What is your recommendation? Because I think most people don't want another war, but is that what we need? Do we just need to go in there and just blow everybody up?
Well, blowing everybody up is a time-honored way of winning wars. But it's important to remember that ISIS got so big because the same kind of methods that Obama had no problems using in Yemen or Pakistan, using drone strikes, were not being used against ISIS. So ISIS had this kind of umbrella that it was a problem that Obama did not want to talk about or deal with, and it got very big and very scary. It can be beaten down with airstrikes. People have the idea that we need to send in troops there or conduct another occupation. We absolutely don't need to do that, and we should not even think of doing it. But at the same time, we should be bombing ISIS targets wherever they are, not necessarily in support of the Iraqi government or let alone the so-called moderate Syrian opposition, but because they're enemies of the country and they plan to make war against us.
In Front Page Magazine, you wrote an article called A Christian Federation in the Middle East. You wrote, to stand against the rising tide of Islamism, the Christians of the Middle East will have to transcend ethnic and doctrinal differences. They'll have to put aside memories of persecution and old rivalries if they have a future in the region. Can Christians survive in such a volatile region? What are their alternatives?
As a minority, I think it's very unlikely that Christians will survive. The numbers are already very frightening. You can look at the example of the Jews, who basically no longer exist as a minority in most of the Middle East except in Israel. The article essentially suggests that Christians need to follow the Israeli example and try to set up a state or a series of states that can actually protect Christian populations, because relying on the goodwill of Muslims is not going to cut it anymore.
Well, how can they do that, though? Because they don't have the support even of America. Because it seems like the only people that are even concerned about the Christians being slaughtered in the Middle East are some churches, but most people just don't even want to talk about that.
I think part of the problem is that there's no clear agenda. When people talk about protecting Christians, there's no defined policy as to what that means. To actually get somebody to do something, you have to tell them specifically what it is that you want. That's really been the problem with Christian persecution in the Middle East. People are angry, people are upset about it, but there's no specific thing, what do we do about it? That's part of what this article is meant to address.
And so what do we do about it? How can we help? If there's something specific we can do and we can start, what's one thing that we can do right now?
Well, the most basic thing that we can do is start making economic aid and military aid dependent on protecting Christian minorities. That can work in places like Egypt, which are, to some extent, have a certain kind of rule of law. It's not obviously going to work in places like Saudi Arabia or Iran. Beyond that, I think that Christians need to follow the Israeli example. They need to set up state or states where they are the majority and they no longer have to rely on the tolerance of the Muslim majority, because that tolerance is really very lacking.
Right. But it also seems that this administration hasn't really lifted a finger to help pretty much anyone, except they are sending 3,000 troops into Africa to fight Ebola. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Well, it's important to remember that Ebola is not the problem. Ebola is a religion of peace, I'm told. But the administration's real problem is that it really doesn't want to deal with it. And the only time that it does deal with it is when it faces enough embarrassment, as it did with the Kurds. And then it actually finally belatedly steps in. And you don't want to get to a point where the Christians are facing direct genocide before the administration will finally belatedly do something.
In your blog, Sultan Kanish, you wrote a brilliant article called The Head Chopper Next Door. And you talked about how the Western media humanizes monsters, basically. And you wrote, while there are some converts attracted to Islam for its violence, The Muslim convert usually doesn't convert for the killing. He kills because he converted. Likewise, the nice Muslim jihadist next door might well be moderate by inclination and immoderate by faith. Why is it that Muslims don't distinguish themselves between being moderate or radical? Why do we have to do that, and should we?
Well, the whole term moderate and radical, that's our perception. It's how we perceive Muslims. If a Muslim is shooting at us, we say he's radical. If he's not shooting at us, we say that he's moderate. But that's our perception of it. It has nothing to do with Islam. On the other side of the coin, it's how Muslims see what they have to do at a given time. So you will have groups, for example, like the Muslim Brotherhood, that the Obama administration decided was good political Islam because they weren't shooting at us right this very second. But in fact, they had the very same agenda, for example, as ISIS. They just had a different way of getting to it. And that agenda would, again, mean an Islamic state. It would mean no rights for minorities. It would mean an Islamic supremacist theocracy. So when we say moderate or radical, it's really completely misleading.
It seems like that's a dangerous thing for us to be doing in America, too. And I know that even Fox News doesn't like to say, they try to distinguish between the two, and they try to be politically correct. But are we politically correcting ourselves to death?
We are, and we're repeating Saudi propaganda. The whole idea that if we acknowledge that Islamic terrorism is Islam, the terrorists win, is an idea that the Saudis have put out, and it's actually a brilliant way of getting us to completely deny Islamic terrorism, even when we're being killed by it. It's a great strategy because essentially it tells us that if we acknowledge what's happening to us, the terrorists win. So our only way out is denial, and through denial we will somehow defeat them. I mean, that's really the plan that Kerry laid out in the Senate.
I asked Robert Spencer this. It's a difficult question. Why do you think the Obama administration, what do they have to gain by denying Islamic terrorism exists?
Because then they would have to fundamentally change their policies. If you acknowledge reality, then you have to adapt to reality. If on the other hand you deny reality, you can just keep on doing the same stupid things you were doing before. For example, the Soviet Union insisted that collectivization was working, no matter how little wheat there was. They just manipulated the statistics, and meanwhile people were starving to death. That's really the way that the left acts. It's the way that socialists act. They assume that their ideology is correct. They assume that their policies are correct. It's just reality that's out of whack, and if they relabel reality, if they shift some definitions around, they're going to be fine. So one of the first things that the Obama administration did was try renaming terrorism to man-caused disasters. You know, once you just stop calling it terrorism and start calling it man-caused disasters, then everything's fine. The terrorism no longer exists. The battle has been won.
How do we fight like this? This seems so ineffectual. It seems like we're setting ourselves up for some serious problems. And we still have several years to go with the Obama administration, and it doesn't look like it's going to be any better after that, because so far the Republican Party doesn't really have anyone they're setting up to change things. What do we do as citizens to stop this? Can we?
Well, the Republican Party largely follows the leads created by other people. So what we can do is change the dialogue and introduce new ideas, and that effectively forces them to address those ideas. The Democrats are very good at denial. The Republican establishment mainly jumps on any idea that comes along. Why those ideas are bad or stupid? Because they get their ideas from the media. They get their ideas from professional wonks and so forth. And our job is to actually challenge that. And if we can actually win that debate, then we can turn things around. We can get some of the same politicians who jump from one issue to another without actually understanding it to adopt a more realistic point of view.
Something that fascinates me about the media is they would rather attack someone like you or Robert Spencer or anyone at Front Page Magazine rather than attack an Islamic terrorist. Why do you think the media, how has it been so successful in creating this strange dichotomy where they put the monsters, they turn them into the good guys, and people like you that are trying to say these are the monsters, you're the ones who they demonize?
Well, for one thing, I'm a lot less likely to suicide bomb CNN than a Muslim jihadist.
So it's because they're not afraid of you.
Criticize me.
So is it a matter of fear that they're afraid if they call out the actual monsters that they can get killed for that? I don't understand it.
There are two kinds of fears. The first one is the one that I just described. That's the simple, that's the physical fear. But for people who truly believe something, that can actually be the lesser fear. The bigger fear is the threat to your identity. It's the threat to the sense of who you are. And that's really the big threat to the media, to liberals in general. It's what keeps them from acknowledging the reality of Islamic terrorism, because if they acknowledge the reality, they will have to change. It's easier, as I said before, to relabel, to change the definitions, and to shoot the messenger. And that's what they're doing when they attack anyone who mentions it. Mm-hmm. It's just easier to shove Islamic terrorism into the same old box, to treat it as a misguided civil rights movement, to say that Muslims are just an oppressed minority, because then they don't have to change. And by they, I don't mean Muslim terrorists, I mean the liberals who are pushing this. They can just go on the way that they have before and act like 1995 and 2015 are just 1965 all over again.
Mm. On your Sultan Kanish blog, you wrote an article called Obama's Iraqization of America. And you wrote the there's a correlation between the way Obama is dividing America racially, economically, socially, and the way Maliki divided Iraq. Would you explain that a little bit?
Well, Maliki governed in tribal terms. He had the people who were part of his identity group who were in the government, and the people who weren't, who were outside the government. That badly divided Iraq, and there are obvious similarities to what Obama is doing in the United States, and that's reflected in the polls. It's reflected in the poll numbers. There are really some striking gaps, for example, between white voters and black voters. There are striking differences between other groups, because what Obama is doing is really not governing by making an argument, by putting out a set of ideas, let alone hope and change. What he's doing is saying, you're part of my group, and you can be in power as long as I'm in power, and you people over there, the ones clinging to your guns and Bibles, you don't belong, and I'm against you. And it divides, and it says that if you belong to one tribe, you're supposed to be for him. If you belong to another tribe, you're supposed to be against him. It's the opposite of the American way of life.
It's so difficult to fight this kind of thing. Daniel, I've got just a few more minutes. I've got to ask you, when are you going to write a book? Because I want to read it.
Well, when I get some sleep would be a good start. But I've been writing on and off. The problem, of course, is that changing events throw out a lot of things and force you to deal with the new things. And the difference really between us and the other side is that we actually deal with changing events, while they just try to shove it over into the same thing, so that 1965, 1995, and 2015 are the same thing, and we're still fighting the Vietnam War over again.
How do we survive? What's your suggestion? What would be one thing you could tell people to do to prepare for the next decade?
I think it would be hold close to your common sense. There's an Orwell quote that I like about the first duty of sensible men being to restate the obvious. Restating the obvious is about one of the most important things that we can possibly do, and it's fairly simple and easy. What the other side has to do is cover it over with lies and obstructions and prevent people from dealing with reality. And common sense means dealing with reality. The various threats that we're going to face, some of them can be predicted, some of them can't be predicted. But what we can do is always stick close to reality, pay attention to what's really going on, and then we can be flexible and adapt to whatever is happening. It's the people who aren't in touch with common sense, who aren't in touch with reality, who aren't really paying attention to what's going on, but who plug everything into their ideology, they're the ones who are in real danger.
Wow. Daniel, keep shining the light of the truth. We're all watching you. I'm following your lead. I'm in awe of you. Thank you so much for being here. And that's all the time we've got. Thank you all for joining us tonight on the Glazov Gang. Jamie will be back, I hope, soon. And we'll see you next time.